I'm really happy to be here today. It's been a really interesting day. I think that the multidisciplinary perspective that has been brought to bear on this question of immigration and community revitalization has been really valuable for me personally and hopefully for most people in the room. And one thing that's really struck me in listening to the papers today is the extent to which context really matters when we talk about immigration. And there's so many different contexts across the country, old destinations versus new destinations, declining cities versus thriving cities. And it sort of problematizes what I'm attempting to do, which is to sort of pull back to sort of the satellite level of the entire United States. And the way you can think about what I'm doing is I'm looking at 3,000 different stories about immigration in the United States and trying to draw out some common threads among them. And so, the caveat is that there's some abstraction that's necessary when you do this kind of work. But hopefully, I think that there's some important message here. So the way that I think about this project, it's a project that I was inspired to undertake by a couple of nonprofit organizations working on immigration in the United States, a partnership with the American Economy and the American Society Council on Americas. What these organizations are trying to figure out is what to make of this narrative that you hear a lot in the modern immigration policy debate, which is that immigrants take our jobs. It's a narrative that sort of belies a worldview in which there's a finite amount of work to be done in the United States. We bring in additional people. That means there's less work to go around. I think, and I'm going to show you some data today that suggests that worldview is not really accurate. But part of what the exercise here is to try to come up with the counter-narrative. Okay, so why is it the case that you shouldn't believe that? And so we're going to talk a little bit about the conceptual framework, and I'm going to talk about the way that I did this quantitative analysis to actually show that, I'll give away the results. The results are that when immigrants move into a county, and the analysis is going to be the level of the county in the United States, it prevents manufacturing jobs from leaving that county. Most of you are probably aware that over the past couple of decades, manufacturing employment has declined in the United States as an absolute level, and certainly as a share of the economy, it's gone down for a much longer period of time than that. But what we see is when immigrants move to a county, the number of jobs it doesn't decline by as much. And so new opportunities are created. Another indicator that you'll see is that when immigrants move to a county, if you thought that meant less work for natives, you might expect the natives to move away. In fact, we find that the native population responds positively to an increase in immigration to a county. And all this has impacts on the housing market, which is in some sense the impetus for the study in the first place. Immigration contributes to housing values. Now, and that's a story that has, there are different ways to look at that, but I'll try to disentangle that result for you a little bit to help you think about whether the impact of immigration on housing values is good or bad, given the fact that we worry about housing affordability in some parts of the country. Okay, so the first thing to say is that, that there's been a lot of work along these lines before. There's an ongoing debate between labor economists David Card and George Borjas about just exactly whether immigration is good or bad for the labor market, where I'm not going to get into too much detail on that. Immigration in the housing market, there have been a couple of studies that have gone before mine. Albert Seiss, who used to be here at Penn, did some work. Ottaviano and Perry have also done work. They've looked at different geographic levels, state level or metropolitan area level, so I'm going to go down to a little bit finer level of granularity in terms of geographic data. I'm also going to incorporate rural areas, which in many parts of the country, immigration to rural areas is an important part of the story. Okay? This is your Economics 101 story about what effect immigration should have on the housing market. It's pretty simple. There's supply and demand. Immigrants need housing. When more people need housing, we see the demand curve for housing go out like this. So it's a straightforward prediction. The price of housing should go up a little bit compared to a situation with no immigrants. And you should see more housing be built. Okay? It's a pretty straightforward story, but then it's a little bit more complicated to think about, is this good or bad? Who wins and who loses when something like this happens? There are potential for indirect effects. Okay, so one thing that might happen when immigrants move into a county is that the natives might move away. Maybe they move away because there's less opportunity for them. Maybe they move away because they don't like to be near immigrants. So it could be that some of this positive effect that we would have expected to see in the housing market is undone. by the flight of natives from the area. And that's why I'm going to do a separate analysis to see just exactly what happens to the native population when immigration increases in the county. These indirect effects could be positive, okay? And so here's where we get into some of these other stories. So there's a story about jobs in America don't necessarily need to stay in America. And the question of whether a manufacturer or any kind of employer keeps their operations in this country or moves them away or replaces labor with machines has to do with what kind of labor is available in the United States. And immigration increases the amount of labor that's available in the United States. You talk a little bit about multiplier effects. So this notion that when someone comes and takes a job in your community, most of the income that they earn, they turn around and spend in your community. Okay, so their income turns into income for other people. So they demand services. They need to buy food. If they have cars, they're going to need to buy cars and get them repaired. They need housing, all sorts of things. And another thing to keep in mind is that there could be impacts on quality of life in the local area. And so this is where the discussion of crime comes in a little bit. The notion that when immigrants move to a community, the community becomes better off than it was before. That what had been a situation where you had high vacancy rates and lots of social ills, you might actually turn some of these neighborhoods around. And there will be a couple of stories I'll be able to tell today. Given all the data that's lurking around here, the storytelling will unfortunately be brief. Okay, speaking of data, so what I'm going to do for this analysis, I'm going to look at counties over the period from 1970 to 2010. So it's decennial data. Alaska has no stable counties. There are a couple of weird counties that popped up in Arizona and New Mexico, and Virginia has this thing with independent cities. So I had to delete a few observations here and there, just to make sure that I was working with places that did not change their boundaries over the 40-year time period. That gave me 3,109 counties. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the foreign-born population in that county and see what happens, what's the relationship between foreign-born population and the native population, or the median home value. And I'm going to control for a bunch of other characteristics of what the housing stock looks like in those areas. I'm also going to include county fixed effects and year fixed effects. So now, unfortunately you guys are getting the somewhat technical version of the talk, but basically, the econometrics here is trying to be rigorous, and it's trying to rule out an alternate explanation, okay? The alternate explanation that I'm trying to rule out is the story that it's not that immigrants are contributing to the vitality of communities, it's that immigrants only go to places where the vitality is there to begin with, okay? And so everything that I'm doing here that looks somewhat complicated, I'm doing in order to try to rule that story out. And I'm not even done telling you about the things that I'm trying to do to do that. So I have one other source of data that I'll tell you about. It's county business patterns. This is how I can track manufacturing employment in counties between 1970 and 2010. Not only do I get overall manufacturing employment, I get how many jobs were in each of 20 different manufacturing industries. There are a few counties that I have to discard because there's close to no manufacturing employment in those counties, but I'm left with about just over 2,000. Okay? So, in addition to using all these fixed effects and controlling for a bunch of variables in my analysis, I'm going to do what's called an instrumental variable strategy. So I really want to get at the causal effect of immigration on these variables, and the concern is that there's going to be basically reverse causality, that the immigrants are going to where the jobs are, the immigrants are going to where the vitality is. But there's actually another story that you can tell that goes the other way, which corresponds to some of the stories we heard earlier today. Immigrants might be avoiding the expensive places. Okay, they might not be going to San Francisco or the city of Boston because those places are expensive and they need to be someplace where they can afford the housing. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to try to identify a factor that predicts whether immigrants will move to a county, but has nothing to do with conditions on the ground as they develop after 1970. Now what I'm going to take advantage of is the notion that immigrants tend to go to places where there are already people of their own nationality living. Okay? And I wish I could take credit for this strategy, but it's as old as the hills in academic time frame. Okay, this goes back to the late 1980s and into the 1990s. There were studies that used this exact same methodology to try to examine the impact of immigration on a lot of different things. So the basic strategy here, I mean, you can read the slide if you want to get into the technical details, but I'll just tell you the intuitive perspective on this. Basically what I'm doing is I'm looking at 1970 and saying, how many immigrants did this county have of each nationality in 1970? And on the basis of that, I make a prediction. Okay, I know that between 1970 and 2010, the number of, say, Slovakian immigrants didn't increase all that much. But the number of Salvadoran immigrants increased a lot. So if you happen to have Salvadoran immigrants in 1970, I'm going to forecast that your county will receive a lot of them in the decades to come. And the timing of them would coincide with when the Salvadoran immigrants arrived in the United States. A lot of them in the 1980s, not so many of them in later decades, and so forth. And instead of actually measuring how many immigrants are in a county, I'm going to use my forecast instead. Okay? And by construction, the forecast doesn't have anything to do with actual economic conditions on the ground in the county. It's all based on a forecast that comes straight from 1970 data. Okay? That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do something similar for the manufacturing analysis. Basically the manufacturing analysis, I'm using a little bit less data. But again, I'm going to forecast not just the number of immigrants in the county, but I'm going to forecast how many manufacturing jobs would I have expected this county to lose between 1970 and 2010, because we know that some industries fared worse than others. So if you were in primary metals, like Gary, Indiana, or Pittsburgh, we know that your manufacturing industry was destined to do pretty poorly. If you were in medical devices, or say food manufacturing, those didn't fare quite as badly. So I'm doing some of that as well. And in the manufacturing analysis, I'm going to see, did your county lose more or fewer manufacturing jobs than we would have forecast on the basis of what industries you were concentrated in 1970. Okay. So the way that we do this analysis, we estimate two statistical models. It's a two-stage regression analysis. The first thing that we're trying to determine is whether it's really true that my forecast has some truth to it. So when I forecast one immigrant in a county in 1980, is that correlated with reality? The answer is that it is. When I forecast, my forecast is correlated pretty strongly. A t-statistic there is going to be about 15, which, if you're familiar with the way these models work, that's pretty good. So my forecast is good enough to be used in this type of analysis. And here's the impact on housing prices. So what I did here, I adjusted the housing prices for inflation, and I just asked when one immigrant moves into a county, based on my forecast, what happens to housing prices? And the answer is that they go up 11.6 cents. Okay, 11.6 cents doesn't sound like all that much, but when we get to the end of the talk, I'll show you how that turns into $3.7 trillion. Stay tuned, okay? So, and what's interesting about this is that you can kind of use this model to see, on the basis of my analysis, where is this impact on housing values happening? What I've got here is I've got a map that shows you the New York metro area, and I've sort of color-coded the counties in the New York metro area, which include the 5 boroughs of New York City, to see, the darker your county gets, the greater the impact on housing values that you attribute to immigration. And what you see is that the lightest colors are associated with Manhattan. Okay, Brooklyn is not all that dark either. It's Queens, it's the Bronx, it's some of these suburban areas where you really see the impact of immigration on housing values, because that's where the immigrants are going. Okay, so what's happening in the Bronx? The Bronx has basically the strongest impact. Housing prices in the Bronx are approximately, according to my estimates, about $6,700 higher because of immigration over the past 10 years. The effect in Manhattan, is approximately 39 bucks. Okay, so why is housing so expensive in Manhattan? It's not a story that has anything to do with immigration. Why has the Bronx turned around? That is a story that has a lot to do with immigration. Okay, Manhattan is more of a story of Seinfeld or other types of phenomena that might be going on, right? Okay, so native population. For every immigrant that moves to a county, I predict that 0.4 natives follow. So it's hard to think about 0.4 of a person, so think about it this way. For every 1,000 immigrants, we get 423 natives that follow along. Of those 423 natives, in the interest of full disclosure, about 150 of them are the native-born children of immigrants. So set those 150 aside. That is still leaving 270 natives. for every 1,000 immigrants that follow in. Okay, so that would not be happening if the arrival of immigrants was just taking away all the economic opportunities in the county. Okay, so that's that result, and that is part of what helps to explain the effects on housing prices. Manufacturing, the first thing I'm going to show you for the manufacturing analysis is that the first stage works, is that when I forecast how many manufacturing jobs you're going to have in 2010, once again, it's a pretty strong prediction, and it correlates pretty strongly with the number that you actually have. So if you forecast that Gary, Indiana is going to lose a lot of jobs because it's concentrated in the wrong industries, you know, that works. Okay. So here's what happens, and once again, so when you have an increase in the foreign-born population, again, I'm using an instrumental variable analysis to try to get at issue concerns of reverse causality. When you take 1,000 immigrants and add that to the local population, the answer is that you preserve or create 46 manufacturing jobs. Okay. That might not sound like a lot of jobs, but bear in mind that manufacturing currently represents about 8% of the U.S. workforce. Okay, so 46 out of 1,000 is not that bad given what the state of manufacturing in the United States today. It's approximately 1 out of every 7 manufacturing jobs remaining in the United States. You can attribute it to the impact of immigration, according to these numbers. Okay, so, and now some implication slides that I'm going to talk, that I'm going to wrap up with these, and these sort of tell you things that I might have said already. Okay. So 1,000 immigrants creates 46 manufacturing jobs. Bear in mind, 8% of the workforce is manufacturing, and just about 70% of the adult population is in the workforce. So when you think about those 1,000 immigrants and ask the question, how many manufacturing jobs did those immigrants take themselves? Okay, you come up with the result that the number of jobs they create or preserve is greater than the number that you expect them to take in the manufacturing sector alone. This is to say nothing of the service sector. Of course, the service sector, if you think about education, if you think about healthcare, how many jobs are there going to be in the healthcare industry? That all depends on how many people there are to take care of. Okay? So population increase, very obviously leads to a greater demand for services in those sectors. Okay? Adding 1,000 immigrants draws in 270 natives. So there's a degree of complementarity in the labor force. Okay? So, you can think about immigration is concentrated at the high and low end of the skill distribution. When we think about the high end of the skill distribution, you think about the fact that when we have foreign engineers with foreign-born engineers with PhDs contributing to high-tech industry, they're also adding to job opportunities for natives who can come and work in the same companies. Sometimes also doing the engineering work, but sometimes just serving the support staff. At the low-tech end of the spectrum, when you've got foreign-born line workers working in manufacturing, and that might involve things like slaughterhouses and other types of low-skilled manufacturing, that's creating or preserving opportunities for natives as well at that end of the spectrum. Sometimes in supervisory roles or in back office roles, etc. All right. Now the housing, I promised that we turn 11.6 cents into $3.7 trillion. So here's the way that you do the math. Okay. So 1,000 immigrants, so that's, the first bullet point is basically saying the same thing. If one immigrant means 11.6 cents, then 1,000 immigrants means 116 bucks. Okay, so if you're an immigrant and you move into a county, the housing prices go up 11.6 cents. Now bear in mind that the typical immigrant resides in a county that has 800,000 housing units. So take your 11.6 cents and multiply that by 800,000. Okay? So, what that means is that when you arrive in that county, the benefit that you have bestowed on the owners of residential property in that county is on the order of $90,000. Okay? So that's $90,000 per immigrant on average. 40 million immigrants in the United States. You take your 40 million times $90,000 each on average, and you come to $3.7 trillion. Okay? Now, a couple of caveats with this. Now, that's looking at all the housing stock in the United States. Some of that is owner-occupied, and if you're a homeowner, that's good for you. Some of this is renter-occupied. For a renter-occupied housing unit, it's the landlord who reaps the benefit in terms of an increased value of the property. From the renter's perspective, it's not necessarily a good thing to have your rent go up. Okay? And so this is where things get a little bit tricky. So we look at places like the Bronx and we see in the Bronx, there has been this turnaround in a lot of these neighborhoods. For people who own homes in the Bronx, this has been an unmitigated good thing for them. For the people who are renting in the Bronx, because the Bronx is one of the few places they could afford to live in New York, the news that, guess what, the Bronx is a little bit less affordable now because now you have immigrants living there. It is true that the rents have gone up. But you have to bear in mind that at the same time that the rents have gone up, life has changed for residents of the Bronx in a lot of other ways as well. Crime has decreased quite a bit. There are more opportunities. I know a lot of people who live in the Bronx are going to still go to other boroughs to work, but there are more businesses in the Bronx at the street level. There are more opportunities to work there. So, any kind of situation like this, in the housing market, when you have an impact like this, it's going to create winners and losers. You count among the winners the 65%, well, I mean, Gary might say that there's a different number based on his methodology, but you know, the home ownership rate, people say is 65%. So if you're a homeowner, this impact is good for you. And this is not just an impact that we see in cities. If you look at places like Houston, if you look at Gwinnett County, Georgia, you see the impacts in these counties as well. These are counties that have received a lot of immigrants over the past 4 years. If you are a renter, if you're a lower income renter, there's kind of a mixed bag here. This very well may imply that your rents are higher than they used to be. There's the flip side of the coin, which is that your neighborhood may be a safer, better place to live than it used to be, and evaluating whether or not that makes someone better off is tricky. And that just about does it for me. So thank you.